All right, I'm going to read chapter 30 and chapter 31, which will finish off this part. Chapter 30 is called The Executioner. Moments later, the boy was dragged, kicking and screaming, from his cell by two royal guards. They hauled him to one of the turrets on top of the Tower of London. Thunderclouds rolled overhead as a wicked wind whipped through the sky. There, on the turret, was the Queen, squashed into a metal cage that was swinging in the air. Creak, creak. The cage was something that had been around since medieval times. It was used for coffin torture. The cage was just big enough for the Queen's body, but not big enough for her to move. The expression on her face betrayed the agony that she was in. "Mama!" cried Alfred upon seeing her. "Don't you dare hurt my son!" yelled the Queen at the guards. They threw the boy to his knees. He scrambled up and raced over to his mother. He hurled himself at the cage, his little fingers poking through, desperate to comfort her. "Be strong, Lionheart," she whispered. "Be strong. We're going to get out of here alive, I promise you." But before the boy could reply, a giant of a man, his face hidden by a black hood, dragged him away. He was the executioner. "You are coming with me, little one," he said in a deep, rough voice. This was the same man who had been interrogating the Queen in her cell not long before. "No!" cried Alfred. But the executioner was so much stronger than him. Soon the boy was tied to a huge wooden wheel. Yet this wasn't just any wheel. This was a breaking wheel, another instrument of medieval torture. A giant wheel that revolved a person as their limbs were broken, one by one. Without a word, the executioner ensured that Alfred had been secured properly by yanking on the ropes around his wrists and ankles. "Ah!" exclaimed the boy as his skin was burned by the ropes. However, the torture was yet to begin. "Revolve the wheel!" called the executioner, and the royal guards did his bidding. Slowly, Alfred began turning on the wheel. He felt dizzy as he hung all the way upside down. As the wheel revolved, he started to feel sick. Now, your magical majesty, tell us where the revolutionaries are hiding," began the executioner, "or your darling little boy will be crushed to death." "For the last time, I don't know what you're talking about," shouted the Queen. "I would tell you if I knew anything, I promise. But I don't. Put me on that thing if you must, not him. I beg you. He's just a child." "I wonder if when one of your son's limbs is smashed to pieces, it might just jog your memory." "No, please," she pleaded. "I don't know anything. I swear." The executioner shook his head before holding aloft an iron hammer, ready to strike the boy and smash his bones to smithereens. Alfred shut his eyes tight. He couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen to him. "Stop!" called the Queen. "I'll tell you everything I know." "I knew you'd see the sense," replied the executioner. "Now untie my son and I will talk." The executioner was not used to taking orders. The man bristled and paced over to the cage. "Where are the revolutionaries hiding?" he demanded. "I said, untie my son first," the Queen said sternly. Alfred was amazed that his mother could retain her composure at a time like this. The executioner nodded to the guards, who began loosening the ropes around the boy's wrists and ankles. "Don't tell them anything, Mama," pleaded Alfred. The Queen chose to ignore her son. She waited for him to be freed from the breaking wheel. The boy's eyes were streaming, and he was completely out of breath. He had to be helped up by one of the royal guards. "Your precious little prince is free," began the executioner. "Now you tell me what you know, right now." The man swung the head of the hammer onto the palm of his hand. Thwack! A tiny bit too hard. He had hurt himself. Ouch! he said, no doubt wincing underneath his hood. I am waiting. Next he dragged the hammer slowly down the bars of the cage. Clunk, clank, clink. Please, I'm a very busy man. I have a whole tower of prisoners to torture and a list of executions as long as your arm. The Queen stared straight at Alfred and nodded her head. He struggled to understand what she meant. Without giving the game away, he furrowed his brow as if to ask, what? The Queen nodded her head again, tilting it to one side. This, the Prince thought, must mean she wanted him to get the executioner's attention. I will tell you where the revolutionaries are, announced Alfred. The executioner turned around. The Queen smiled. Her plan was working. Will you now, you nasty little wrench? Asked the executioner, not sounding at all convinced. Or are you just playing games? With all eyes on the Prince, the Queen was free to rock her cage to and fro. In a few swings, the cage was gathering momentum. Whoosh! Alfred did his best to let his face portray absolutely nothing of this at all, which was hard, as it wasn't every day that he saw his mother swinging around in what looked like a giant birdcage. The revolutionaries have a number of secret bases across London, Alfred continued. They hide in what used to be the underground stations. The executioner rolled his eyes. This is old information, and you well know it. The rats were driven out of those sewers years ago. Now the cage was swinging violently, so violently, in fact, that it was very nearly reaching the executioner. Executioner! Called the Queen. He turned round. What? Only to be whacked on the head by the cage. Clonk! Ooh! He toppled over and fell off the top of the tower. Ah! Plunging into the river below. Splosh. I can't swim, he cried. And chapter 31, this one's called Disaster Strikes. Just a very short chapter. Landing on one of the turrets of the Tower of London, Alfred looked over to his mother for the next part of the plan. Sadly, she didn't have one. Run, she shouted. But Mama, I have to save you. Please, run, please. The boy looked across the turret. Guards were blocking the way down. What's more, one of them was coming straight for him. Alfred escaped by darting around the back of the cage. Whack him, called his mother. With all his might, he swung the cage forward and it smashed straight into the guard. Clonk. The guard toppled backwards, knocking over a few more guards as if they were skittles. Bish, bash, bosh. Ah! Nice work, young prince, said his mother. The guards scrambled to their feet and were now circling Alfred. Run, Lionheart, run, shouted the Queen. Only you can save the kingdom now. No, I'm not leaving you. With that, the boy leaped onto the back of the cage to make it swing faster. Bash! It smashed into one of the guards. 4 down, 1 to go, Alfred said. Don't get cocky, remarked his mother. However, Alfred didn't listen. He began swinging the cage as fast as he could. To create more momentum, he arched his back to go faster and faster. As he did so, disaster struck. Just as it swung off to the side, his hands slipped from the bars of the cage. Ah! Alfred found himself falling through the air, heading straight for the River Thames. And that's the end of this part.